Wow, what a great turnout. I hope when I'm Bill's age, this many people come out for me. I mean, I hope I'm still here when I'm Bill's age. Anyway, good afternoon and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And we're extremely delighted to be hosting Bill Luers, who's here to talk about his new memoir, Uncommon Company, Dissidents and Diplomats, Enemies and Artists. So, over the years, P&P has sponsored talks for a number of memoirs, and it's become quite clear that people writing about their own lives don't necessarily need to have reached a certain age before authoring an autobiography. I mean, we've had memoirs by relatively young people, middle-aged people, elderly people. At 95, Bill definitely falls on the elderly side, which for one thing goes to show that you're never too old to get around to publishing your life story. But the other lesson to learn from Bill's example, and it's an inspiring example, is that for a memoir to be meaningful for readers, it should put a life in perspective no matter how long it's been lived, and Bill's book does that very, very well. Of course, it helps to have lived a very interesting and accomplished life, as Bill has, marked by long public service and by vigorous promotion of the arts. He spent more than 3 decades, 31 years to be exact, in the U.S. Foreign Service, which included stints as ambassador to Venezuela in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and Czechoslovakia in the mid-1980s. That was still when there was a Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia was a part of that. Later, he served 13 years as president of the Museum of Modern Art.
Oh.
I mean, Metropolitan Museum of, that's what I meant.
He jumped out of his skin.
I don't know, my script writer here, I've got to really talk to them. He then was president of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. Along the way, he also found time to lecture and teach and to serve on several nonprofit boards. It was 1957 when Bill, after several years in the U.S. Navy, joined the State Department and was sent to Naples, Italy to be vice consul. Not a bad first overseas assignment. Returning to Washington in 1959, he was assigned to the Office of Soviet Union Affairs. But within a few years, he was back overseas working in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Maybe not as quite, the climate isn't as great there as it was in Naples. But that's when he was in Moscow in 1963, that he was given an assignment that, as he says in the book, would change the trajectory of his career and his vision of diplomacy for the rest of his life. And the assignment involved accompanying Edward Albee, then a young playwright, on a tour of the Soviet Union. And that was part of a new initiative involving U.S. cultural exchanges that, in the U.S. view, would hopefully heighten awareness in the Soviet Union of American cultural, intellectual, and artistic freedoms. That moment, that episode, was really important for Bill, as he explains early on in the book, because he became a quick believer in this sort of cultural diplomacy, and his subsequent interactions with American and Soviet cultural figures had a profound impact on him and on his appreciation for the power of culture to bridge differences among peoples. And that belief in the power of culture is the main message of Bill's book, as we're all about to hear him elaborate on in just a minute. He'll be in conversation this afternoon with Greg Craig, who is an old friend of both Bill and Wendy's, and a prominent Washington attorney who served 2 U.S. presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and also advised Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Senator Ted Kennedy. So please join me in welcoming Bill Luers and Greg Craig.
Bill. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have not met Bill Luers before, his life is much more interesting than the list of titles that you just heard and the offices that he's held and the places that he's been. we're in the presence of one of the most wise and interesting and experienced public servants of the last 200 years that the United States has experienced itself. And as we just heard, he's written this wonderful book that talks about presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens and foreign ministers and senators. And even better, the fact that he hung out with musicians, jazz musicians, and painters and writers, really cool relationships with all those folks. But when he wrote this book, he dedicated it to someone by the name of Wendy. And does she have something to do with this?
Yeah, yeah. She's the core of the whole operation. That never would have happened without her.
Tell us why.
Wendy and I married halfway through our lives together. And my daughter's here. I divorced my first wife at a time when I'd fallen in love with Wendy, and we weren't terribly outgoing about our surprise marriage. But I think what you've got to know about Wendy is she's from San Francisco and La Jolla, and I'm from Springfield, Illinois, and those are two locations that are incompatible. And as Wendy kept telling me, and when I took her to Springfield, I took her there after we'd been married, and she fell asleep while I was driving to the town where my mother had a farm and was brought up, called Pleasant Plains, of all places. That exciting little town of Pleasant Plains, not far from where Lincoln lived his childhood. And Wendy fell asleep, just to show me how bored she was with the flat land I lived on, I was grown up in. Boring. And when we left Springfield, I bought my little statue of Lincoln, and she bought me a T-shirt which had a big picture of Lincoln on the cover, and on the back was a sign saying, they'd have to shoot me to get me back to Springfield. And that's been her feeling about this relationship.
In your book, Bill, you write, "This book is my testament to how the arts can be used to move our nation and our world toward higher levels of cooperation and understanding with each other." Could you tell us some of the experiences in your life that lead us to agree with that conclusion and what we can do about it today?
I think I'd like to start with Eisenhower, who, as the general during the Second World War, who helped us win the war, he himself came to office to replace his well-known Harry Truman. And I realized the power that existed then of the arts, which is not often known. And he established U.S. Information Agency, which set cultural exchange as its priority. And Ike stuck with it. Kennedy carried it further. But I'll say that my first exposure to artists was when I was in Moscow, and I met the great Edward Albee and John Updike, who visited, and my Russian was good enough, and the ambassador designated me to accompany these first two cultural visits. And John Steinbeck came along with Edward Albee, and it was thrilling to me because Albee none of you know this, but he was an impeccably honest person. And he spoke to the Russian writers and leadership to the extent that he got a chance to talk to them with a candor that is just not, I was not believing of it. And he was so honest about everything he thought. And he talked to one Soviet who was accompanying him, said, "If you ever disagreed with your government at any time," and the Soviet said, "No." "Yes, of course I have." And Edward said, "Where?" And he didn't reply. And Edward said, how did you agree? How did you think about the Hitler-Stalin Pact? And he said, well, he gave the party line that Stalin was trying to delay the invasion of the Soviet Union and to reinforce his army. And Edward lambasted him. And actually he said, I'm going to kill you. And I was a little nervous about my role with cultural exchanges when Edward threatened his person who was accompanying him that he was going to kill him. And it was a 12-hour train ride from Moscow to Kiev. And I was a little taken back. But I didn't know Edward at all at the time. But the thing is, if any of you have seen Virginia Woolf, the play or the movie, know that the core of the story is we're destroyed by stories we tell ourselves that we believe. And he kept telling the Soviets about their belief in this question of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And we were in Odessa at the time. He'd asked to go to Odessa because he wanted to see the stairs where the Eisenstein movie was done. The steps where so many people were killed by the Tsarist forces. And it's called the Potemkin. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it's a story in which there's a baby carriage which famously goes down the stairs. It's one of the most iconic visions in any film. And Edward wanted to see those stairs. And so we saw the famous stairs that afternoon. And in the evening we went to the opera. And Edward didn't like to sing the soprano. And we were walking back to the hotel, and I was telling Edward how mammoth the cultural tradition was in Odessa, a town, a Jewish town, which had been populated by Soviet Jews who made Odessa one of the great cities of Europe. And I told Edward that year the three most in-demand violinists in the world are from Odessa. And Oistrakh and I was in the middle of telling him this story, and we arrive at the hotel, and there's a huge mob out in front of the hotel waiting for us. I said to Edward, I've done something wrong. There's a big problem here. I didn't know the Soviet Union very well. I knew Russian quite well. And the head of the hotel called out to say, Kennedy's been killed. And it was that night. And we walked in the hotel, and there were hundreds of Soviet citizens from the community from Odessa listening to the Voice of America, which is not permitted. Listen to the Voice of America reporting the death of Kennedy directly from Dallas. And Edward and I were both, to say the least, shocked, as everyone was at that point. And the Soviet citizens from the community were worried that their government had killed Kennedy. And I assured them all that I didn't think that was true, knowing nothing about what I was hearing on Voice of America. And we talked, and I've never felt such camaraderie with Russians that I did that night. And Edward wrote back home his laments about how he arrives in Moscow to visit the Soviet Union, and this is what he encounters, the death of his president. And the thing is, I've always thought Kennedy, when he said goodbye when he gave the eulogy for Robert Frost, who famously gave the poem at Kennedy's inauguration, said that the role of the arts is not to promote propaganda. Arts are for the truth. And I was in the company of Edward, who had convinced me that he was committed to the truth, whatever it might be, including the question of whether you tell yourself lies and believe them. And so the more I traveled over these years in Venezuela and Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, the more I learned how true it is what Kennedy said about artists everywhere wanting to find the truth. So I began to become a true believer in the arts and the role of artists, and depended on them enormously in my diplomacy, in Latin America particularly.
I have a list of the people that you invited to Venezuela while you were ambassador that includes Peter Matthiessen, Tom Wicker, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., John Updike, and the Styrons.
Yeah.
And you had a great story about John Updike and the Russians. You developed a very close relationship with John Updike.
Yeah, John became a very close friend, and he visited me in Moscow, in Czechoslovakia, and in Venezuela. And I was with him a lot. And the thing about John is he was obsessed by languages. What is known, he loved English and spoke and wrote it well. But he had a particular obsession with Nabokov because he liked the fact that Nabokov, English was his second language, and he wrote brilliantly in English. And John considered himself and was a master of the English language, and was always frustrated by the fact that he never really could write literature in another language. And over the years, he came to listen to me talk about how his Latin American people, their culture is their language. And unless you understand that, that the Spanish language is the Latin culture and how much they depend on the language. And John began to study, because he visited me so many times in Venezuela, he began to study Spanish. And he, at one point, wrote me a 10-page interview of questions from a Venezuelan journalist, was given his full answers, and he described why those questions were important for John. And in his answers, I was so taken by his love for the Spanish language and by his realization that Spanish is key. But the funny thing, my great story of John was he wrote a book. He wrote a series of books called the Beck books. And he created this fictional American writer called Beck. And Beck was a Jewish writer. I always thought it was his way of writing about he and another visitor, John Cheever, maintained they were the only non-Jews left as writers in the United States, and both of them were visited me in Venezuela, and well, by the way, I haven't talked about Wendy nearly enough, and anybody who knows me and knows Wendy knows that she's a major factor in my life, in our life together. We were partners in everything we did. And when she first came to Venezuela, a year after I'd been ambassador, she came with her two daughters, my two daughters, and I was heard to say to her one time, "Wendy, Jimmy Carter appointed me ambassador to Venezuela, not you." Because Wendy got to sit next to the foreign minister, and I was sitting next to his wife always. And I didn't have nearly as much to say to his wife as Wendy had in formulating U.S. policy with the foreign minister. But she was with me everywhere. And it's her relationship with Havel that was so key.
Well, that's what I was going to ask next, because your relationship with Václav Havel is really quite an extraordinary story.
Yeah.
You went to Czechoslovakia in 1983 when it was still under the domination of the Soviet Union. Just fly. I just can't ignore it. Tell us, there's the playwright who then became a president, and I think you got to know him very early on in 1983-84.
Yes, he came for our vernissage, opening our art exhibition at the Met at our house, and we had as our guest
As ambassador, you had an art exhibition in your house.
in the house, yeah,
Yeah.
of American paintings, and we had there at the time Francine Gray and her husband Cleve Gray. Francine, as you know, is a great American writer, and her husband Cleve Gray was a painter who were standing in the library. I walked downstairs to the opening of this vernissage, and we invited 200 of the dissidents that we got in contact with through the embassy list, and they were all standing in the library talking to Francine. And Havel was in the library with them all, talking to Francine Cleve. And one of the things that you know about Havel is how funny he is. And he held the group of dissidents that he gathered together over those next several years. He held them together by humor. And I was always struck by that quality he had. And humor and music. He thought Mick Jagger was the top musician in the United States. And he loved, I remember one time we went to, Mick Jagger was doing a concert in New York for Bill Clinton. And Clinton was there, as was the former president of Poland, who was a friend of Havel's. And I had come back from a long trip. I think I'd come back from the Soviet Union. And I was tired, and Wendy knew I was tired. So I wanted to go home. And I asked Václav whether he wanted us to take him home. And he looked at me in utter amazement. With Mick Jagger and Bill Clinton there, why would he want possibly to leave that place?
Now, I recall you telling me that there was an occasion where you were asked by Henry Kissinger at a very formal event with the president of Czechoslovakia to ask the first question.
Yeah.
Thinking that it would be a slow ball.
This is when he was visiting Connecticut. He was visiting Milos Forman and us, Wendy and me, in
Milos Forman, the film director,
filmmaker, who's his great pal. And Henry had invited us to lunch. We all live in the same area. And Henry asked me to ask the first question after he'd introduced Havel, and after Havel said a few remarks. And my question to Havel was, you have said as your mission for the post-communist Europe that you would have reconciliation, that Germany should be united, which was not a popular theme, and Havel promoted it. But why do you want to join NATO now? You now say you want to join NATO, and you're for the NATO enlargement. I was absolutely opposed to it. And I said, how does your idea of reconciliation further the thought that you should join NATO? It was clearly the biggest divider between Russia and Europe and the United States. Why would you want to join them? And he said, because it's the only club I could join. This is one of the key issues that Wendy and I disagreed on. Wendy was with Havel all the way. That was a club you need to join. And I was opposed to the enlargement of NATO, and I still am. But he stuck to his guns, and they joined NATO, and they're still powerful supporters of NATO and the war against Ukraine.
Now, when Havel came to the United States as president, you were in charge of his schedule in New York.
Right.
And I guess Madeleine Albright was in charge of his schedule in Washington, D.C.
Right.
But he was complaining to you, was he not, that he had to give speeches everywhere he went?
Yeah, I had organized a day, the likes of which, even during the height of my talks, I never would do for myself. And he must have had one day at Amnesty International, with the Cardinal, at every place they wanted him to speak because they thought he was such a philosopher, king as he was. And he said to me one time, as we were going from one of the spots to the other, he said, Bill, why do I have to speak at every place? He said, I'm a playwright and an essayist. I'm not a speaker. I'm not an orator. I don't like to give speeches. But I said, Václav, your problem is you've become the Oracle of Prague. And the Oracle of Prague is expected to declare himself every place he goes as a spokesperson for the end of the Cold War. And you're it, Chico. And he accepted that. He still was never an orator. But the amazing thing, which the great Craig remembers, when Havel spoke to the joint session of Congress in Washington when he was invited on a state visit, there was a question he asked me several times, what should I ask for? I don't want to ask for money. But he got to the end of his speech and he said, I'm inclined to ask a major help from the government of the United States. He said, I think you have to devote a great deal of time to making the Soviet Union follow the democratic path they're going to have to cover. That's the only way they can go. If they don't go that route, we're all in trouble. Shadow. He literally anticipated the Korean War, and it was so wise of him, even while he advocated the expansion of NATO. And I've also told Greg, by the way, who's a great man.
This is about you, Bill, not
yeah. I also told Greg one of my wonderful stories about Havel as a comedian was he went to visit the Soviet Union many years later when actually Yeltsin was in charge, and he was to call on the head of Soviet Union, who was then Yeltsin, I guess. And the wonderful story is that he'd just come to the United States on one of his trips to the United States. Maybe the one where he came and visited Wendy and me and Milos Forman. And he couldn't decide what to give to the Soviet leader as a gift. There's always exchange of gifts. And he gave a peace pipe, an Indian peace pipe he had received from an Indian tribe in the United States. And Howell thought it was a nice gesture. And the Soviets weren't as convinced as he was that it was a way to...
Bill, another way that you deployed your relations with American writers and painters and jazz musicians was your meeting with Castro. You brought...
where you and I first met. Yeah.
It was not in the presence of Fidel Castro that we first met, but I had some Castro experiences, and you had some Castro experiences, and lo and behold, we found ourselves in a room about this size after being invited to have a very small meeting with representatives of an intelligence community of the United States who wanted to find out what Fidel Castro was really like. And so Bill Luers, who had just, you'll hear what his story is about Castro, who had just had a full day and a half one-on-one with Castro and Arthur Miller and Bill Styron and Rose Styron and Wendy. We were going to have this small meeting where we could really tell them exactly what sort of guy this Fidel Castro is like. And it was a room filled with people at the Metropolitan Club that we ended up talking to. Whether they were all from the intelligence community, I don't know. But that's when I really got to know you. It was about year 2000, 2001. But you had this amazing experience with Castro, sitting and talking about Marxism and philosophy and revolution in the backseat of the car for an hour and a half, one-on-one, with Juanita, I guess.
Yeah, it was his interpreter. And we sat in the back of the car with machine guns on the floor, and he had three Mercedes, one in front and one behind. And at the end of the conversation, in the dinner the night before with Arthur Miller, Garcia Marquez was with us. And Garcia Marquez has obviously told Fidel, these are two very bright American writers. You got to treat them seriously. Don't give them your standard garbage about how much you hate the Soviet Union and how much you thought Stalin screwed up the Second World War. And so in this car conversation, which we talked for hours, and I was taking notes the whole time. I still have those notes on a yellow pad. And so I wrote so much that at the end of my note-taking, Castro said to me, Bill, I'm going to write my own story. I don't need your help in doing that. But I said to him, you know, you've told me about all these revolutions you started and promoted in the world. And I know most of these countries, and I know most of those revolutions. And as far as I can figure, none of those countries is better off because of them. And I said, do you feel any guilt? He said, no. I said, why? Why do you feel no sort of sense of responsibility for all the Cubans and local revolutionaries who died in these flawed revolutions? And he said, because por la doctrina, he said. I said, what's the doctrine? He told me the doctrine is that when there's injustice, there must be revolution. And that's what he believed. And he believed there was still widespread injustice in the world, which of course he's right. But I'm not sure it justifies all the killing that he undertook. But the wonderful thing is, I think when Garcia Marquez had told Fidel that these two writers were so important in the United States, he said, now be serious. And so what Fidel said, he had some questions he wanted to ask the people who were having dinner with him, particularly Arthur Miller and Bill Styron. He said, I want to know, who do you think is most likely to believe in life after death? Scientist or a writer? And Bill made the effort of writers, and I made the effort on scientists. And Fidel looked at me and said, you're right. It's the scientists who are likely to be the most inclined to. And Arthur found the whole discussion terribly boring. And he said, Comandante, I don't have an answer to your question. All I do is I know one thing. I read last week that 70% of Americans think they're going to go to heaven, and only 10% of them think they're going to meet anybody they know there.
Now, before we go to the diplomacy trend, I'd really like to hear the story about your friendship with Paul McCartney and your project with him.
Oh, yeah. McCartney began because of Wendy partnered with me when I was at the UNA on my program to clear landmines. And his wife, Wendy's good friend, John Eastman, introduced us to Paul because John's sister was Linda McCartney, who'd been married to Paul. And so Paul contributed millions of dollars to clearing landmines by giving concerts in Los Angeles, which we charged, we got $1 million easily every dinner. And he did it year after year. And one time I called Colin Powell and I said, I'd like to bring Paul McCartney to meet you. So we went to see him. And we went into the State Department, the corridors of which were crowded with people because they'd all heard that McCartney was coming. And we went up to the Secretary's office. And as you all know, he was Secretary of State. And he was surrounded by a bunch of Foreign Service officers. And his former secretary had been my first secretary in the Foreign Service, who was named Marjorie Jackson, who was an amazing woman. And she had arranged for us to get together with the secretary. And when we walked into the secretary's office, he called me over and said, Bill, I'd like to talk to you and Paul for a minute beforehand. And he looked Paul right in the eye and said, Paul, I spent several years in Vietnam, and they were the unhappiest years of my life.
The unhappiest?
Unhappiest. And the only happy moments we had were singing Beatles songs. And tears were streaming down his face. He was so moved by meeting Paul. And Paul was moved. And Paul and I have shared that particular moment. And the tale must be told that we had asked the Secretary of State to interfere with the President to sign the treaty to ban landmines, which we refused to sign because defense wanted to keep the option open to have landmines. And Powell did not intervene with his former colleagues in the Defense Department and changed their song on the subject of the landmines treaty. But it was a moving moment, and we left the State Department. I think everybody in the State Department, the thousands of people there, came out and watched Powell walking down the hall with, and by the way, that picture is on the cover with Paul McCartney and
Upper left. Can we get to the second theme of your book, which is also really important? My message, I'm reading you, this is you. My message to the leaders of this country is clear. Diplomacy works. We must talk to the other. Now, what if the other is only interested in your destruction? What if the other is working against you throughout the world to defeat you and destroy your society? Do you still talk to that other?
You do. You have to. And I mean, the key issue is Hitler, as we know. Should you talk to Hitler like they did in Munich, like the British and the French did in Munich? And
well, Munich is a big example used against talking to people.
right.
Most American diplomats want to be Churchill, not Chamberlain.
Yeah.
And you have that experience with Dean Rusk, where Dean Rusk, when you were working for the INR, talked about Vietnam and Munich in the same sentence. What did he say?
Yeah, I was head of a group that started a dissident group within the State Department, and I was supported personally by Rusk in that. But then I wrote Rusk a note at one point. I said, one of the things that he asked me at one point, well, what should he speak about when he goes to universities? And I said, don't use Munich as the reason for Vietnam. Most students think of Munich as beer halls and places of pleasure. Munich means nothing to them. I said, I want to talk to you about it. And the staff set up a meeting for me to have my little conversation of why Munich wasn't working. And I never got to have that conversation with him. But when we left, the Foreign Service had a big farewell dinner for Dean Rusk. And the last word he said was the last phrase he said to us all. He said, all of us have been through this difficult period, but we should never forget Munich.
So that was your success with Dean Rusk.
Yeah.
But the Iran project, can we talk a little bit about the Iran project? Because that has a lot to do with the subject of talking to your adversary and communicating with your adversary, even under the most difficult circumstances.
Yes.
Tell us what the Iran project was and what your role in it was, and what we should do now, Bill.
What?
And what we should do now.
Yeah. I was then head of UNA, and I got to know the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, who was Javad Zarif, who became later the foreign minister of Iran. He was an amazing guy who'd been at the University of Denver, and he'd studied with Madeleine Albright's father, and he was a brilliant man who spoke perfect English and was very subtle in the way he dealt with English. And he agreed with me that we should, and I got Tom Pickering and Frank Wisner involved, and they helped start what we called the Iran Project, which was a dialogue with Iran to find out ways to persuade them not to have a nuclear weapon. And Obama bought into the package and pulled off this agreement called the Comprehensive
JPCOA.
JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was not a treaty. It was sort of an agreement with the Europeans. And when we signed it, I already knew it was fatally flawed for rare reasons. And John Kerry tried hard to make it work. And John, who was then Secretary of State, got a lot of frustration over his inability to make it work. And I got a letter from the president thanking our work for helping them bring around the agreement. And Obama lost office to this guy who's now again back in office. And the first thing Trump did was pull out of the deal and kill the effort we'd started to stop Iran from a nuclear weapon. I still think there is an option with Iran, and I think our effort continues, and I think we will be able to head off this nuclear weapon if we somehow could continue the project, which seems unlikely given the current president of the United States. Sadly.
Let me ask you one more question before we have questions from the audience, and that has to do with Ronald Reagan's relationship with the Russian leadership. You had a conversation with Mike Deaver at one point about whether it would be possible for the person who gave us the words, the evil empire, would ever be able to work with the Russians. And what happened?
Yes, I don't know if many of you remember that period of when Reagan became president. Dobrynin said, "How do you expect us ever to work with this administration, given what he said about us?" And I talked to Mike Deaver, who was, as many of you remember, was the right hand of Nancy and Ron Reagan. And Deaver, I said to Deaver, I told Deaver the history of American presidents, and I held that every American president has left office thinking that their relationship with the Soviet leader was the most important relationship they had for the peace of the world. And Mike said, "Not my man." You know, he made it very clear he didn't think Ronald Reagan would ever succumb to the siren call of Soviet leadership. And what was impressive is Mike, then after I'd gotten through telling him the story of how Roosevelt and to some degree Truman had wanted, and certainly Kennedy had felt that the relationship with the Soviet Union was terribly important. And he said, "Bill, you may be onto something." And he said, "I'll tell you why I think that." He said when Reagan was shot, and that spring after he was elected, after he took office, I went to the hospital with him, and he asked me, before they put him in a coma, that he wanted me to bring a piece of paper and a pen, which I brought him a few days later when he emerged from the coma. And I brought him the yellow pad and the pen, which I'd done so many times before. And I knew he was going to write a letter. And he went several days later. He came back, and Reagan had written a letter to Brezhnev on his own. Obviously on the verge of death, he thought. And he knew that the relationship with Brezhnev was very important. And this is a warm letter that set the stage for later coming together of the United States and the Soviet Union, which, and as everybody knows, by the end of Reagan's presidency, as predicted by Bill Luers to Mike Deaver, Reagan had assumed that the most important power in the world for the United States was Soviet Union, and the Soviet leader was the most important person for him to deal with. It's a wonderful story about Reagan and about the dynamics of this, we're not going to be able to talk about my theory on.
There's time. Someone's going to ask you about what we do about this election and how to happen.
Okay.
I'm sure that's going to happen. But before we go to the questions, this is advice that Ambassador Luers gives to the American people, very briefly. This is advice that Ambassador Luers gives to the American people on the subject of getting out of our silos and talking to each other, which is exactly what he argues for in international diplomacy. The rules are simple. Listening is better than talking. Asking questions is better than confrontation. Total long-term victory in verbal or actual combat is not possible, nor should it be sought. Talking with your adversary is better than warring. Humor is the great mediator. Any questions?
Mr. Luers, did I get your name right?
Yeah.
I was interested to hear you mention that you've interacted with jazz musicians. I'm a jazz musician myself, and I was inspired to ask you from hearing that tonight. Do you believe that there is hope for jazz musicians and by extension the artists of the artistic community in Washington, D.C.? And how do you believe that that hope stands to endure for the future?
I just think it's so obvious that Americans are so taken by our popular music and by jazz. Havel was obsessed by jazz, by American music. And I'll tell you a secret, that Mussolini, the great fascist dictator, was obsessed by American jazz. And I think there's a place for music everywhere. When we had, this is not to answer your question about jazz, but when I was advising the American ambassador in Moscow, who was worried about how the New York Philharmonic group would speak, what would be the common language with the visiting, with the Soviet Philharmonic. And I said, their common language is music. And it's the common language we all have. And it keeps us going. There's no question in my mind that you're in the right area. Music is it. I'd love to hear you
so
sometime.
much. Oh, thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you, Mr.
What do you
Luers.
play?
I'm a bassist. Sometimes I play at Mr. Henry's right here in Washington, D.C.
Oh, good.
But I'm still
My-
rising that totem pole.
My daughter's husband is a jazz player. Good.
Bill, you mentioned Mussolini, and that prompts me to ask the question that we might not get, which is, do you have a theory as to what happened and why it happened
Yeah, I have.
in this election? And
As
would
you
you like
know,
to
I have-
share it with us?
I have two theories, and I try not to make them too long. The first is that Italy and Germany were brought together by Garibaldi. Italy, which was a country that was divided, brought together by Garibaldi, and Germany by Bismarck. And I lived in the south of both Germany. I lived in Bavaria and Naples for a long time. And both regions have similar relationships to their countries. They're extremely Catholic. They're way in the south, and they felt put upon by the North. And the term fascist, it's not an ideology. It means nothing other than it means a group of pillars that are held together by a tight string, which by very tight control. And a crazy poet named Gabriel D'Annunzio and a philosopher whom I knew about, Giovanni Gentile, created fascism out of a vision of state socialism for the purpose of finally uniting Italy after the First World War, when they realized that the Risorgimento had not pulled Italy together. The Risorgimento had failed. And Bismarck, of course, did the same thing in Germany. In the late 19th century, Germany came together with Bismarck, and it didn't work. The German states stayed separate. And I like to make the analogy that we're in a stage of we've never gotten over the Civil War. Just like the Risorgimento and the unification of Germany were brought together by strong men, they were not held together. And I think Trump is the strong man trying to hold this country together. And the American people somehow instinctively voted for him because they thought they needed this force of bringing the United States together. I'm not saying this is a vision of Trump, but I'm saying it's the reason a strong man is called for, because we never resolved our differences after the Civil War. And I think that the election of Barack Obama drove home to Americans in this distant part of the world that we were not a united country. And my other theory, which, as you know, is it's in addition to the Mussolini phenomena. And Trump looks like Mussolini. I don't know if you've known that, but he looks like him a lot. And my other theory is the retaliation of the Latinos. I'm convinced that the United States has never accepted the its Hispanic culture in its society. And during my time in Venezuela, I became persuaded that gringos didn't come south to Venezuela because they have a racial bias against Hispanics. And I think Hispanics tend to know that. And even though they brought so much wonderful music and pleased so many people, they have not been accepted as white people have been accepted. And they have felt displaced to some degree in their destined role by the black community. So I think that the rejection of the Democratic candidate was in part flowed from the Hispanic retaliation to the Democratic Party for having rejected the Hispanic vote and never developing a Hispanic strategy. And during the Carter administration, I had a personal experience with that phenomena. The Carter White House insisted that I go to Latin America to meet with the head of the Democratic Party of Puerto Rico, who was, this is while I was ambassador. The Hispanic community had requested I be replaced and kicked out of the Foreign Service because I was a anti-Hispanic, which is, of course, rubbish. And Wendy knew it. Wendy had all these friends who were in the Hispanic community and got them lined up on my behalf. But the guy I was supposed to see in Puerto Rico is named Franklin Delano Lopez, believe it or not. And Franklin Delano Lopez, I flew down at Cy Vance's instructions to meet the famous Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom I'd never heard about before. And I met in a restaurant that he set, and I cooled my heels for an hour before he arrived. And he arrived rather arrogantly and sat down and began talking to me and interrogating me about my attitude toward Hispanics. And I told him what I felt. And then he started laughing. He said, "Bill, we know you're a good guy. We know you want to help us. But the White House hasn't given us enough jobs, enough recognition." And he left me sitting there at this lunch, having gone through the torment that I went through. And I was convinced that Carter and subsequent Democrats would find some hostility among the Latin American vote. And I think it'll be demonstrated that Latin American voters did not favor the Democratic Party this time.
Do we have time for one more question? No.
One very quick one. Is there a quick one?
Oh, thank you so much for this. It was extremely interesting. I'm a foreign policy consultant. My question would basically be about the BRICS Plus experiment. The BRICS Plus, the new Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa country, the new that is recently expanded. It is in line with your argument that you should talk to people who are potentially not willing to do so with you. I think this is even more true about the BRICS Plus experiment, but they just had their annual summit in Kazan, Russia, and it was spectacularly ignored by the mainstream media and even by mainstream academia, even if right now it's no longer just a matter of ethics and values, it's a matter of hard power. They represent approximately half of the world population. In terms of purchasing power parity, they actually represent more than global GDP comparing to the G7, and yet there is almost a complete silence, lack of interest in that. I mean, if you could share your thought on that, and what should be the strategy, if we should change the strategy, and I strongly believe we should, and why, what is the reason for this quite misguided lack of attention on what the BRICS Plus experiment is doing? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I guess I feel that as my interlocutor here has said, we have to talk to everybody, and you have to talk to the other, particularly if they're an enemy or if they're opposed to what your objectives are. And in that case, it's crazy that we didn't pay attention or recognize that. And that part of the world, I've traveled in a lot, and I know it. And I've got a lot of stories about it. I feel that we have to know what's going on And without following that course, we won't know. And I feel strongly that we should know enough about what Putin's doing to know when he's ready to talk. And during the whole Soviet period, we had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and we were always able to talk to them, even during that difficult period with Reagan. And a diplomat wants to do diplomacy, and I'm in that mode. And I think not to follow phenomenal trends like you're describing is a big mistake for the United States. And I don't know why we haven't paid attention. But if there are three messages that I want to leave from this book, one is diplomacy works. You've got to persist in it and be determined. You should always talk to your enemy and know what they're thinking. And if you don't know what they're thinking, you can't devise a strategy for talking to them. And third, that the arts, particularly music, is the great mediator among human beings. And we miss a big opportunity for the United States, which is so active and thorough in its appreciation of the arts.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Great, thank you, Bill, and thank you,